We are running a little bit behind on time, so I am just going to start with this. Hi, sorry if you were here yesterday and have heard my introductory spiel. I'm Rachel. I am a reporter and editor with The Economist, where I mostly cover climate change. And this is a conversation that I actually think will be very interesting. So I have with me on stage Paul Polman, who was for a very long time, 29 years, the CEO of Unilever.
No, I wouldn't be sitting here.
Right,
10 years.
I've insulted you somehow. Anyway, long time
But
CEO.
I'm older than 29, that's true.
Okay. And has subsequently written a book called Net Positive about how companies have to think differently about their environmental and social impact and responsibility, and also, I think, works with companies to help them align themselves with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I also have Clover Hogan, who is a climate activist and the founding executive director of Force of Nature, which is a youth nonprofit which both helps young people act on climate change, but also consults with companies to kind of help them do the same. Yeah. Mostly, I want this to be a conversation between you guys. I'm kind of immaterial to the process, but just to really kick us off, please could you, A, add anything to the introduction that I've either mangled or missed, and also just tell us something in your work that you feel like you're constantly still having to try and explain to people. Sure. Paul, do you want to go first?
Well, I can go very briefly, but what the reason we're here is to do some of the things to see how we can accelerate. If I just listen to the previous panels, and a lot of wise words were shared with us, a lot of good intentions were given. But at the end of the day, you look at this decade where we need to go down 45% on carbon emissions. We're still going up 10.6%. I mean, everybody who believes in science can listen to all the stories of what we're going to do between now and 2030 or now and 2050, but the reality is it doesn't add up. We don't sit here and say we've just approved this in Alaska or this in the Gulf, or we've just given more subsidies to the fossil fuel in Europe to stimulate investments or to keep them competitive. The numbers just simply don't add up, so we shouldn't be kidding ourselves. We don't have to be rude to each other, we don't have to be panicky, although it's pretty late in the game, but we have to be realistic about what is going on. And so I'm constantly looking at how do we accelerate action, real action, and obviously the private sector is such a big part of it, and I feel fairly familiar with that, having worked there my whole life. And one of the key changes that we now clearly see is the employees themselves as a real force to accelerate this change. 75% of people feel disengaged at work. That's a very sad statistic if you think about that. And we spend so much time there, and this is how we feel. So they care about companies that are making a better impact in the world. They care about this world being better. And increasingly we see that they have moved from the research we've done amongst about 4,000 people, they've moved from silent quitting to conscious quitting. They see 1/3 of their CEOs saying things and not doing things. They see their companies not making aggressive enough commitments, playing not to lose versus playing to win. And increasingly they're getting dissatisfied, up to the point that half of them have said that they, 1/3 have actually consciously quit those companies, and half of them are considering doing that. So if you're a CEO, you're sitting on a freaking ticking time bomb. And if you don't understand that, I don't think you're worth the label of CEO anymore. So we need to go to these companies and tell them what this enormous cost is that they are incurring by frankly being irresponsible. So we look at solutions because increasingly people want to be part of the solutions, and they're calling for bigger ambitions. They're calling for better communication on what companies are doing. They're calling for more involvement and empowerment to do something about it. So if you talk to millennials,
well,
Gen
I am going to
Zs,
cut you off in a sec.
Yeah, I'll finish my sentence. So if you talk to millennials, Gen Zs, they are very constructive, that they don't want to just criticize us all the time, but they actively want to be part of that solution. Which comes back to my final argument always is don't just get them at the table, but increasingly give them the table.
I've honestly been pretty staggered by the levels of denial that I've heard in this room this morning. The first talk that we heard was incredibly self-congratulatory. At no point... It at no point acknowledged the enormity and urgency of the climate crisis and the danger of the continued not only incrementalism, but frankly gaslighting of this government when it comes to solving the problem, we were asked to sympathize with the fossil fuel industry, an industry that has systematically over decades spent billions lobbying against climate action, an industry which every year continues to make more profit without actually investing in real renewable infrastructure, an industry that every year kills hundreds of environmental land rights defenders. An industry where every company wants to be the last company to extract the last barrel of oil. So for all the money that is spent on greenwashing and trying to convince the public that they need to be at the table and that they have a role in the just transition, they've appropriated all of the language of the climate justice movement, and yet they're not sincere in their actions.
Okay, I'm also going to cut you off as well. So, okay, given this, given this viewpoint, and I think it's very important to be honest about the fact that there is utility and benefits for politicians or companies for talking about this kind of stuff. Given that, what do both of you see your role as in what are you actually trying to persuade people to do?
I mean, to stop tiptoeing around the problem and pretending that business as usual is somehow miraculously going to solve the crisis. We're not going to solve climate change with the same people and the same types of thinking that created it. And frankly, if we keep pretending that everything is fine, that this isn't the greatest threat humanity has ever faced, then we're not going to solve this crisis. No commitments today put us on track to limiting degrees of warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? No commitments. That's not actions. Those are the kind of false promises that we're all too familiar with. We're on track for 1 billion climate migrants by 2050. We're on track to lose all of our coral reefs. We're on track for a massive, widespread ecosystem collapse.
Okay, so what would you ask?
Absolutely, I'm getting there. But frankly, the past 2 hours have been climate denial platformed on this stage. So I think it's important, as this audience recognizes, to actually acknowledge the starting point. So what we need to do, we need to stop tiptoeing around the issue. Companies need to stop pretending, again, that tokenism is going to solve this crisis. There is no hope in another 10 years of incrementalism. And as Paul's work has so expertly highlighted, young people are falling into despair. Young people are choosing to work for companies that actually align with their values and where they're not being gaslit. And a lot of leaders are acknowledging that that is, in fact, a greater existential threat than their perceived existential threat of the climate crisis, because they can't actually hire people into their organizations. And frankly, a lot of business leaders are actively defecting from their companies as well, because they too don't want to be the problem, and their kids are coming home to them at the end of the day and asking, Mom, Dad, what are you doing about the climate crisis? And when they look at their legacy, they don't want to be handing over a planet on fire.
I think Paul has a point to this.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is see the world is moving. There's no question that you don't have any CEO who wants more unemployment, more climate change, or more people going to bed hungry. There might be some, but I at least haven't met them. But ultimately, we're not delivering on what we need to do. We're falling way behind. Last year, World Overshoot Day was July 28th, which is the day that we use up more resources than the world can replenish. I would argue that after that date, every day after, we're stealing from future generations. We're living well beyond our planetary boundaries. And if you look where companies are, there is no question that every company, every CEO is probably doing 5-10 times more than the predecessor and shows a curve that has bent and feels very good about it. But collectively, it still doesn't add up. In fact, we're slipping. We're slipping on all of the Sustainable Development Goals, the famous 17 goals. I focus on climate change and inequality, but we're equally slipping on all the other goals. So what we're trying to do with Net Positive is really to get people to move from CSR, which is where everybody is in their sustainability reports, a little bit less plastics in the oceans, a little bit less carbon emissions in the air, a little bit less deforestation in our value chain, as you've heard on the panel. But, when we've overshot these planetary boundaries, less bad simply isn't good enough anymore. I used to murder 10 people, now I only murder 5 people. I'm a better murderer. Give me a break. But this is what we are doing. So we need to get to a mindset of business as well, regenerative, restorative, reparative, where we're actually taking a lesson from nature in this case and making things better. And that is what we call net positive thinking. And there are so many CEOs that, this is not going to be easy, as Clover says, but there are so many CEOs that are still in this less bad, that set targets not to lose versus targets to win. They know it's not enough versus what science says. They postpone it until 2050. They make big announcements but don't put it in action. It is at a point now that it is actually starting to hurt these business models. They're missing opportunities to have a right to stay alive, in a sense. And this is what we're trying to change.
So given this, and I agree with you, I've seen the emissions trajectory pathways. I have seen the outcomes that the IPCC are modeling. None of them get us anywhere close currently to the goals that we have set. Given that, and given that we are kind of talking about what the moral responsibility of companies and individuals is, and if the problem is that we are kind of tiptoeing around the issue, is it that companies and businesses and individuals should be putting more pressure on governments and on decision makers? Like if the argument is that these problems are not going to be solved in this room or on this stage, is it that you have to have new business plans, or is it that you actually need to be doing something else?
Two things I want to say in response to this. The first is that you mentioned morality, and I think it's really important that we actually start there, because part of the reason why we're continuing to sleepwalk toward the edge of climate collapse is because we're continuing to talk through the lens of, but what's the best business opportunity, and how do we ensure this makes the most money possible? And we're not acknowledging the moral imperative, which is that through inaction, through incrementalism, we're systematically choosing to sacrifice millions of lives for the climate crisis. So we actually have to bring morals into the conversation, and that can be a really uncomfortable place for people in business to sit. But that's also why these intergenerational conversations and conversations around the dinner table are driving a lot of leaders to actually acknowledge the ethical responsibility for taking action on this crisis. The second thing I will say is that we have to acknowledge the relationship between regulation and business. I was sat in the boardroom of one of the biggest plastic polluters in the world last year, and very self-congratulatory tone, talking about how they're phasing out virgin plastics. Their head of corporate lobbying piped up and said, oh, but we just stopped that bill from getting through that would have prevented us from making any more disposable plastics. So we have to dismantle the relationship between corporations and lobbying. And of course, we need regulation, but that is very difficult to do if corporations are systematically undermining the power of lobbying. The final thing I will say, and this is really building on Paul's point, is that we need to move from a mentality of kind of do less harm to do more good. So rather than, how do we create a product or a service in pursuit of profit, how do we create a product or a service that is a vehicle for solving a larger societal environmental problem? And that is really the ethos and embedded in the DNA of so many B Corps and companies, social enterprises that are really existing to solve a problem, and in doing so, allowing profit to be the mechanism behind that. But that is really the kind of shift in thinking that we need. And again, moving from sustainability, which is just like how do we sustain the current system, to regeneration. How do we actually bring back the life that has already been lost? How do we restore communities? How do we make sure fair and equitable societies are at the center of any solution that we propose and we campaign for? And critically, at this point, it's not enough to just slow emissions or even stop emissions. We need to actively be sequestering historic emissions as well.
Do you have anything you want to speak to?
No, I agree with that again once more, but ultimately, you need governments, you need the right frameworks, and you need the right policies to move at the scale and speed that we want. And also to get rid of the free riders that are entirely driven by self-interest, greed, or apathy for what is going on. And there are too many of those. So it won't happen until we get governments there. The reality is governments aren't quite functioning the way they've been designed. Multilateral institutions aren't quite delivering the way we thought they would. So I would advocate is find this 30–40% of business that does exist, that has better intentions than others, rally them together, form the broader partnerships across civil society, business and governments to drive these more transformative changes. What we're now trying to do is continuously optimize within a system that frankly isn't designed to deliver anymore, and it leads to lunacy. It leads absolutely to lunacy. So we need to start thinking about the tougher questions. How do we really move financial markets to the longer term? How do we really value these environmental and social issues and put prices on them? How do we really put a reward system in place that that drives us to this net positive behavior. And I think it's feasible. When and where we do that, when companies take the initiatives, when some governments take the initiatives, we actually see everybody being better off. And it starts and ends by putting the people in the center. We talk about climate change, we talk about all the other issues, we talk about deforestation, but we never talk about the indigenous people, the farmers itself. So it's put people in the center, which gets back to the Sustainable Development Goals. Leave no one behind. Irreversibly eradicate poverty. These are the drivers of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's not anything else but being here to serve others and understanding that by doing so, we're all better off ourselves as well. Rumi, a 13th century poet, said it very well. Yesterday I was clever, I tried to change the world. Today I'm wise, I'm trying to change myself. Many would argue we have technology that can solve these issues. We have the financing that can solve the issues. We have the science that supports us, but yet we're incapable of moving. Many would say this is a crisis of greed, of apathy, of selfishness. Ultimately, it's a crisis of moral leadership, and it's in our hands to solve that if we decide to do so. And it requires us to understand that first and foremost, we are connected as citizens of planet Earth, that none of us can succeed. And we're at that point if all of us cannot succeed. And that's where we need to focus on.
And is that going to rely on the sort of 30% or whatever the figure is of kind of good companies who do have who feel the moral imperative as
absolutely. I used to focus
change.
on everything and trying to make it perfect, and that leads to actually it's not constructive. What you need to do is assess the reality of the time and look at the 20-30%, which often is only needed, sometimes less, to get tipping points. When I moved to Unilever, and I won't give any examples there because I actually don't like that, but I called the CEOs of Pepsi, Coke, Nestle, and Unilever, myself being Unilever at that time, in a room. And I said, you have all the beverage cabinets, you have all the ice cream cabinets. Together, we are having these engines in there to keep the products cool. It's CFC, HFC, it's just not good for the environment. There is nobody in the world that buys an ice cream based on the engine in the machine. So why don't we together get a natural refrigerant and move the whole industry and solve 2 or 3% of global warming? That is moving from competitive leadership to cooperative leadership. And frankly, as it comes now to the future of humanity, we cannot afford to compete on so many things as we currently do. So it does require us to change our leadership. It does require us to incentivize differently. So if there's anything where we're short of, where we should spend more time on, to be honest, in this world, it's both leadership and trees.
We are meant to go to audience questions. I can't turn this iPad on, so I think... Okay, they're there.
I have a few more.
They're behind me. Fine.
Clover.
Actually, no, I can see them here. Okay, question for Clover. How do you commercialize solutions, or are commercially non-viable solutions part of your vision for the future? So I guess if you're not going to get rid of the fact that companies want to make a profit, how do you kind of factor that in?
I mean, I would challenge the premise of the question. I mean, the first thing I would say is showing up in a lot of different climate spaces, including COP, there's a lot of emphasis placed on these kind of technological solutions and obviously techno-utopian solutions to the climate crisis. Naturally, technology is a huge part of what's needed, yet again, in my mind, that techno-utopianism can be a version of denial because it's, how do we, again, profit off this problem? How do we delay it into the future? There's lots of talk of carbon sequestration machines and carbon capture, right? And billion-dollar, machines that can sequester carbon from the atmosphere. And it's well, what is a tree then? What are the world's carbon sinks? Nature-based solutions are one of the most effective solutions that we have to the climate crisis. But it doesn't matter if we create another, carbon sequestration machine that's going to line the pockets of a few individuals if we continue to cut down trees for palm oil production, or we continue to destroy the Amazon, a critical carbon sink for beef production, right? And so I think when we're talking about commercially viable solutions, right now there isn't always the financing or investment for the solutions that are actually going to deliver the best climate solutions. That's true in big parts of Africa, for example, where today it is cheaper to make renewables than it is to create new fossil fuel infrastructure, but it's harder to actually access funding for renewables than it is fossil fuel infrastructure. So we need to be looking at the entire systems of what are we actually financing, what are we investing in, and how do we create markets that prop up nature rather than a current capitalist model that values a tree more when it's dead than when it's alive.
But that's a regulation point, right? Like, how do we create markets to prop up nature that value something that's not going to be done by companies, presumably?
I mean, I think it's both.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm conscious of time, but it's regulation and it's companies, and as I've already illustrated, those two things are deeply interlinked. And frankly, government loves pointing the finger at companies and saying, well, actually, it's up to you to find the solutions, and business likes to do that back at policy, but ultimately everyone has a responsibility, as Paul has also already outlined.
Do you have something you want to add to this at the end?
No, I think we're out of time. But
My questions have been taken away as well, so.
yeah, the questions, that's why I was looking for. So, there was one question on how do you start these partnerships, and we're actually seeing them happening more and more. One of your sponsors here is the UN Global Compact. I happen to be the vice chair of that, representing the Secretary General. During COVID, or since COVID, it went from about 12 to 14,000 members to now over 20,000 members. Everybody was saying, membership fees and COVID, it's going to reduce your membership. We've actually seen a dramatic change. And there you have companies aligned, many SMEs that look at getting together around common themes and move things forward. We've created industry alliances with the coalitions of the willing, if you want to, around fashion, around food, around tourism and travel, around the urban built environment. Those are 4 of the industries next to the broader energy transition we've talked about that have a tremendously devastating impact on the Sustainable Development Goals. And what we find now is that you can get 20 to 30% of these CEOs together. But they need to be together. Together they become more courageous. You can create capacity to do things that they otherwise might not be aware of. You take the competitive element out, and what you see, you move forward. We're now moving with Europe to regenerative agriculture. Frankly, it's only 5–6% in the world that's now done regenerative. We can do that in the next 3 to 5 years for 50% and solve a big chunk of the climate issues. They're getting together on fashion and say, how can I jointly buy energy? Many of the small SMEs cannot get to green energy, but we've created one of the biggest energy buying alliances in Europe now to jointly buy energy. So whilst they might seem like modest steps, you obviously accelerate once that trust is built, but it's in these partnerships with civil society, by the way, and with governments. Never do that alone. Business should not have that arrogance. But if you do that together, you can really move the needle much faster than we currently are doing.
I am going to have to stop you because I'm being gestured at from the side of the stage. Although there's a huge amount to talk about, and this could go on for a long time. So I'm sorry that we don't have as much time. Thank you so much. Everyone else clap, otherwise it's just me.